Hello, my name is Avery Kirschbaum, and I'm a third-year undergraduate student at the University of Chicago. As many of you may know, I've been an avid game collector for several years. I began my journey in high school, using any money I earned to buy retro games. At the time, this mostly consisted of Game Boy Advance titles, my first console, although I was too young to truly understand any of the games I played. I intended to rebuild my early childhood while re-experiencing the games in their entirety. When I began taking the course I'm curating this essay for, Digital Media and Social Life Contemporary Methods, I was immediately interested in writing about the phenomenon of video game collecting for the final. This is a topic I'm deeply invested in, having 7+ years of experience. That being said, I will refrain from giving any of my personal viewpoints or opinions until the conclusion. This video will be split up into 3 major parts, each of which will shed light on a different section of video game collection history. In addition, I'll be following 4 games from 4 different platforms throughout the years. Super Mario Bros. 1985 for the NES, Final Fantasy VII, 1997 for the PlayStation 1, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, 1991 for the Sega Genesis, and Halo 1 Combat Evolved, 2001 for the Xbox, tracking their approximate sealed and complete in box prices to give a sense of scale. Without further ado, I present to you The year is 1985. Just 2 years prior, due to a myriad of different factors, many consumers lost faith in the video game industry, resulting in the crash of the market in 1983. While this new and emerging art form has experienced its hardships, with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the home console industry was about to be reinvigorated. Several early adopters of video games as a creative medium began to understand the potential difficulties of preserving it. Unlike other forms of art, games require a specific set of hardware to experience. An individual can go into a bookstore and buy a copy of George Orwell's 1949 work, 1984, or better yet, find thousands of PDFs online. They're not in need of a specific device that reads books released in 1949, in addition to hardware that will hook up with technology from the modern age in order to experience it to the fullest degree. This is an oversimplified argument for the importance of game preservation. There are, of course, tons and tons of arguments that can be made about the importance of experiencing art in its original context and history. Nonetheless, in order to get as close to the originality as possible, it is important to keep complete game consoles in playable condition to ensure that all of its original parts remain functional in order to properly curate and preserve video games for future generations to enjoy. In addition to this sect of budding collectors, many people simply wanted to buy back their childhood. In the 1990s and early 2000s, collectors who grew up playing the NES, PlayStation, and Sega Genesis began entering the workforce, giving them a steady stream of disposable income. As such, they used some funds to buy back their nostalgia. As studied in Bryant et al.'s Populating the Universe, Toy Collecting and Adult Lives, this was a huge motivating factor in the communities surrounding figures and comic collecting. The, quote, intensity of the nostalgia, unquote, was a similarity they found in participants of San Diego's Comic-Con when asked why they continued to collect. Others still were motivated by completing full sets of comics, mirrored in game collecting when an individual attempts to collect a full system library for any given console. These types were eventually capitalized on by game companies themselves, most notably the Pokemon franchise, invoking certain business strategies in attempts to get collectors to buy every single game. One individual I interviewed for this project, Cameron, a longtime collector of Pokemon games, acknowledged how they reeled him in from a very young age and influenced his collecting in the years to come. He felt that the Pokemon franchise played to his pre-existing desire to collect and essentially started him on the track to becoming a video game addict. While game collecting remained relatively niche, with this non-direct recognition of the collector community, it began hitting the mainstream a bit more. The added adoption of eBay as an online marketplace and the inception of dedicated game collecting forums, such as Nintendo Age, r/Game Collecting, and VG Collect, founded in 2008, 2010, and 2011 respectively, further grew the community into something resembling what it's become today. Before I bring in the previously mentioned game prices, I must first define a few collector terms. Many collectors, including myself, only buy complete in box, or CIB video games, which means it comes with the case, the game, the manual, and any inserts that may have been present at the time of purchasing. Others collect loose carts only, while others still collect factory sealed copies, meaning that they're unopened games with the original wrap still on. I am using pricecharting.com, a website that compiles sold listings from the last 10 years on eBay. However, I must put a disclaimer out there that price charting does not take into account the variance in box prints, which means that it gives a very general average. I am not going to just be showing the prices to see how they increase, but rather I will be comparing complete in box versus sealed game prices throughout the years. Historically, sealed to CIB price ratios have remained relatively stable, with around a 2-to-1 difference. Typically, video game collectors like to have their games remain playable. Sealed collecting doesn't allow for this, but may add to the nostalgia factor. For example, a person recalls seeing it on a store shelf and derives emotional enjoyment from its plastic wrap. In the budding stages of game collecting, this is the average trend, from Super Mario to Halo. In these days, the value of the game was mostly derived from its nostalgia and playability, hence sealed games only being around twice as much as their CIB counterparts. In 2008, the Video Game Authority, a company dedicated to both providing authenticity and numerical grades to video games based on condition, was founded. Similar to how sports cards or coins can be graded by a third party, VGA's introduction to the scene was the first notable shift the game collecting community saw in going from hobby to investment. A game needing authentication lended to the legitimacy of the collector's market. The fact that people would feel the need to fake games added to their sense of rarity. Nonetheless, grading games was mostly reserved for exceptionally rare titles, and there was hardly a shift in the prices of most popular games. There was still a fair amount of online discourse within collectors' communities about the need for game grading. However, just as the writer of this 2012 blog post from pricecharting.com stated, it is only a matter of time as more and more high-profile sales of graded games push profiteers to start buying up games just to get them graded, only to resell them and flood the markets. The bubble will burst. The year 2017 brought many notable shifts in the sphere of video game collecting. The hobby was expanding. More people were realizing the importance of video games as an art form, and more still were looking to buy back their childhood. As the years went on, the internet's forums became increasingly centralized and user-friendly. This rising accessibility further fueled the growth of the community. Facebook began seeing video game buy, sell, and trade groups popping up left and right. These provided a more direct medium than eBay, allowing collectors to buy directly from sellers, cutting out the fees and middlemen. eBay, meanwhile, continued to gain registered users, from 105 million in 2012 to 167 million in 2017, and with it, gained a more simplistic interface. It had become easier than ever to collect video games, and this was clearly reflected in the prices. Video games, like any retro collectible, are a limited resource. Only a certain number of boxes, manuals, and games were created, and as time goes on, less and less remain playable and intact. When demand increases, prices do in turn. A new company had joined the scene, primed for investments. In 2017, Wata Games was founded with a similar goal in mind to VGA: authenticate and encapsulate sealed, complete in box, and loose games. They launched their grading in 2018 to a largely unaware collector base. Although prices around the board were increasing slightly with the influx of demand, it wasn't until the beginning of 2019 that games sealed and complete in box prices began to see a noticeable disconnect. It is important to note that several in-depth videos and articles have been published looking into the ethics of Wata as a company. Carl Jobst's Exposing Fraud and Deception in the Retro Video Game Market points out several issues within Wata's structure and leadership, including failure to disclose ownership of collections and several conflicts of interest. Seth Abramson, a journalist and game collector, has also pointed out that one of the co-founders of the company, Mark Haspel, has sold Wata-graded games at premium prices on eBay. This essay is not tackling these allegations of fraud, but simply looking at the impact of Wata and the general shift of the community into video games as an investment. With that out of the way, let's move on. In January of 2019, a sealed copy of Super Mario Bros. Graded a 9.4 A++ seal by Wata, sold for $100,150. Dozens of articles were written on the high-end purchase, comparing it to Action Comics #1 or a Mickey Mantle rookie card. holy grails of their respective hobbies. This came to a head with the season 17 episode of Pawn Stars, a reality show following the items brought into a pawn shop in Las Vegas, in which a seller brought in this very same copy, refusing to take less than $1 million. Although a sale wasn't made, this showing was intended as an advertisement, looking to alert as many people as possible to the legitimacy of the video game market. And it worked. The ramifications of this episode can be seen throughout the complete and box and sealed game prices on price charting. Whereas the difference in ratios was about 1 to 2, after the average person was exposed to the potentially lucrative business of video game reselling, sealed prices were rising exponentially. The framing of the $100,000 sale and subsequent insistence on its massively inflated price on the Pawn Stars episode framed game collecting as the next big thing and helped usher a new demographic into collecting, one that was more concerned with the hypothetical increase in prices than the intrinsic desire to play the games. A noticeable divide began to appear between those who were buying and selling graded games and those who thought it antithetical to the practice of game collecting. This divide would only become more divisive in the coming year. March of 2020 marked the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. Several states implemented mandated stay-at-home orders, halting work and leisure alike. The stock market was experiencing record lows and distrust for financial institutions was growing. Nobody was going out and spending money. There wasn't much to do other than use the internet. In the previous decades, more people than ever grew up with video games as an integral part of their childhood. It was a perfect time to spend extra money getting to own some retro ones. People started buying like crazy, causing a huge surge in loose and CIB prices by June. This was much to the dismay of regular collectors, who were now being priced out of the hobby by individuals just entering the scene. One seller and collector I interviewed remarked that around this time, his local retro scene, including Facebook Marketplace and OfferUp, started to get significantly more competitive. His prices were increasing with the market's demand. People were buying copies of games for more than 50% of their going rates just months ago. In retrospect, he told me, a lot of these buyers later regretted their decisions. Now people in the market were getting caught up in the hype. But this wasn't the only thing adding to the potential energy of the retro video game market. With the pandemic, a greater interest in cryptocurrencies began to draw the attention of young entrepreneurs. With the dramatic changes in stock prices, the dollar was being viewed less and less as a stable value and more as an abstract concept, and so it was only natural that the younger generation began gravitating to an alternate currency. However, cryptocurrency, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has massive issues. From its utility to its wild instability, it is a financial institution that should be arguably less trustworthy than the USD. One day, a Bitcoin is worth 50,000 USD, the next it could be at 35,000 USD or less. As such, it is not a sustainable medium to leave one's money in. Leaving money in crypto is incredibly risky, but simply exchanging it to USD wasn't looking like a much more stable option. That's where the world of alternate investments, which includes video games, comes into play. Looking at the samples of sealed games I've provided throughout the video, it is clear that popular games essentially only trend upwards. Not only that, but they're all popular cultural items that likely resonate with the people buying into crypto. This phenomenon was documented in Luke Winke's IGN article, in which he described several crypto tycoons bidding each other up in a pinball auction, both because they thought it was a good investment and because they resonated with the items being sold. However, because these rich people are bidding against each other, prices start to reach numbers that are simply ludicrous for the items being sold. For example, a sealed copy of Super Mario 64, graded a 9.8 A++ by WATA, sold for $1.6 million in July of 2021. This price was nonsensical. There are speculated to be at least 3 to 5 copies of the game with this same grade, not to mention the relatively common nature of Super Mario 64, selling over 11.9 million units, when compared to a game such as Stadium Events for the NES, with less than 10 to 20 complete copies in existence, and an even smaller number of sealed ones. For reference, a sealed 9.2 A+ sold for $66,000, including the buyer's premium, in March of 2020, right before the market surged. One can absolutely argue that popularity is what drove a sale such as this. But what it looked like to the majority of the collector base was ignorance of its true value. People who had been in the game for years had seen consistent prices. These rapid changes were uncalled for. It seemed like the hobby many had known and loved was falling for people who were only in it for the money. Sealed game prices reflect this. With the ever-growing disconnect between the complete and sealed copies, it was becoming more and more clear that the landscape of video game collecting was changing permanently. The sudden increase in sealed prices had trickled down to complete and box prices as well. More recently, it seems people have begun noticing the massive profits that could be made from buying a select copy of a game, sealed, grading it, and then turning around and reselling it, with these prices sometimes reaching 5 times or more than the original raw sealed game. However, due to the large investment, this isn't feasible for most. What is, however, is doing so with complete and box games. Wata will grade complete and box games. In fact, they go out of their way to advertise it. As such, these prices have started trickling down, especially in recent months, as box prices for popular titles have increased exponentially. This further frustrated members of the collecting community who felt like their hobby had been taken away from them. Sealed games are one thing, but locking complete games in a plastic box away forever, where you can't even play it? What's the point of that? The greater the split between sealed, complete, and loose games, the greater the rift between different collectors in the community has become. Long-term collectors feel like their hobby is being hijacked by those who are only in it for the money. High-end collectors tell others, laughing at their prices, that they're just jealous that they didn't get into the sealed game market earlier. Forums like Reddit have become increasingly hostile to graded collectors, no matter their intentions for actually collecting. On Facebook, due to the harassment graded collectors were receiving, a new group entitled High-End Game Room was formed in 2020, focusing mainly on sales of sealed and graded games. The creation of this group served to fill a niche that was previously completely unneeded and further lended to the polarization of different groups of collectors. And thus, we arrive in the modern landscape of video game collecting. A landscape transformed by the modern world, conglomerates with an agenda in mind, consumers, and those who have been involved with it since its inception. While the original objectives of individual collectors have remained, a new one has been added, motivated by profits. Looking at similar communities surrounding other collectibles, this seems to be a common trend. The more mainstream a hobby gets, the more people take advantage of those who have been involved since its beginnings. But why? The ramifications of this phenomenon, on a more personal level, have disappointed me. As someone who grew up spending allowance money on retro games, intending to experience classics on their original consoles, looking at the current state of affairs is a bit saddening. Collecting has become more and more inaccessible to the average person. Less people will be able to experience landmark titles in video game history as prices continue to increase, instead relying on emulation or hoping for re-releases of the game. I have nothing against emulation. It's a fantastic way to preserve certain titles and make them accessible to all. But it saddens me to know that unless a younger collector has the means to afford an $80 Game Boy Advance and the expensive games that come with them, they will have no other option than to emulate. On the other side of the coin, the increasing hostility towards people that don't collect in the approved way, complete in box or loose games most of the time, being lumped together with those who have no prior care for game collecting, is just as frustrating to watch. Everyone has different reasons for collecting. Sealed collectors aren't less legitimate than complete collectors. The issue should lie with intention, which is difficult to discern at a glance, yet is all too often assumed. There is no clear solution to the state of video game collecting. The market will correct itself or it won't. Some prices have begun to dip for many popular titles as the world continues to open up. More people are realizing that the fad that they got into at the beginning of the pandemic wasn't something they were actually passionate about, and thus are selling what they collected for a small deficit. One thing remains for certain. Regardless of where the market trends, there will always be people preserving titles for future generations. Regardless of what happens next, game collecting will persevere. Thank you so much for watching. Off the top of my head, there's several people I'd like to thank, but first and foremost, Patrick Jagoda and Christian Schilt, the professors of this class, for having such a fantastic opportunity for me to finally look into something that I cared about and analyze it with some sociological techniques. My brother for helping me do the audio and video. He's shaking his head, but thank you very much. I won't say your name, I won't dox him, but he lives at... my parents for putting up with me having all of these video games. This is a very small amount behind me. There are a lot more on the floor. It's disgusting. I think it's great, but they probably think it's disgusting. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, I will be making more long-form content in the near future. I'm really looking forward to it. And all of my links will be in the description. Every one of the, all the people who helped me, as well as the sources will all be in the description. So if you enjoyed, subscribe, like maybe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Catch.
No, I'm not keeping that in. End it.